to the InfoWars Nightly News. It's Wednesday, July 10th, 2013, and here are our top stories.
Tonight on the InfoWars Nightly News, activist Adam Kokesh is raided and arrested by stormtrooper police. Then, it's spy versus spy as Obama orders the government to snitch on each other. And John Corzine will face no criminal charges over MF Global. All that and more coming up on the InfoWars Nightly News.
But in America, they have a hunger to literally put us in jail.
Well, in light of our top story today, I want to start out with a quote from Martin Luther King. He said, "An individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law." That's Martin Luther King. What Adam Kokesh did was to respect the law, something that the District of Columbia is not respecting. They're not respecting the supreme law of the land, the Constitution. And they're not respecting the Supreme Court, which ruled in 2008 in the Heller versus D.C. case that their unconstitutional law about carrying loaded weapons in Washington, D.C. was invalid and unconstitutional. But what we're seeing now is a new twist on unconstitutional, unlawful enforcement of laws. We also see now a new twist of a jurisdictional move. Here we've got a situation where Adam Kokesh exercises civil disobedience in a Washington park, and they come after him in an area outside of that jurisdiction using the federal police. So the federal police are enforcing an unconstitutional D.C. law that has been struck down by the Supreme Court. In our article on InfoWars, Adam Kokesh raided by stormtrooper cops, says numerous police vehicles, including light armored vehicle and 2 low-flying helicopters, barricaded Adams Street. More than 20 armored SWAT team members surrounded the house, as well as a number of detectives and plainclothes officers. Assault rifles were aimed on all members of the team as they were handcuffed without being told why they were being detained. Masked and armored police, and why they wear masks, because they're not obeying the law, and full stormtrooper gear flooded in and ransacked the residence. The team was cordoned in a front room while Adam was pulled aside for questioning, and of course he was kicked as well while he was handcuffed, we also learned. The raid was conducted by Herndon Police as well as U.S. Parks Police, an arm of Homeland Security. And there's an image on the article there that shows media trucks in place to broadcast news of the raid instantly. Kokesh's Facebook page writes, "How nice of the police to tell the media beforehand that we were going to get raided." Well, this is essentially what happened in Waco. If you remember, the media was told that the raid was going to go on, and as a matter of fact, the code word for the beginning of the Waco raid was showtime. That's why we have video of the beginning of the assault of the Waco homestead there. Now, that same mainstream media dutifully reported what they were supposed to do to report the government's side of the story. Even the Washington Times, which is a conservative paper, in their story refers to it as what Adam Kokesh did, as not as civil disobedience, but as a stunt. Here's a quote from their article: "Activists arrested after loading shotgun in Freedom Plaza." They said a controversial internet talk show host was arrested at his home in Herndon on Tuesday night after a videotaped July 4th stunt in which he loaded a shotgun in the district's Freedom Plaza, in violation of the city's gun laws. Now, the Washington Post didn't really talk so much about the gun laws. They mentioned that briefly, but they focused on the charges that he has a hallucinogenic mushroom in conjunction with having firearms there. The Washington Post's headline is, "Adam Kokesh charged with possessing hallucinogenic mushrooms." U.S. Park Police Lieutenant Pamela Smith said her agency executed a search warrant at Kokesh's home in Herndon about 7:45 p.m. Tuesday looking for a weapon. Carrying a loaded weapon, concealed or unconcealed, is against the law in the district, but he was not in the district. One roommate, Ed Yealy, said he was punched in the back of the head by an officer. They estimated 30 to 40 officers participated in the raid, said that clothes were dumped in the center of one bedroom, a mattress was pushed up against the wall. They were there for over 5 hours, drilling through a safe, doing various things, just basically doing everything they could to find anything they could pin on Adam Kokesh. And it reminds me of what Stalin said, or one of his lieutenants, "Bring me the man and I'll find the crime. You have enough time with somebody, especially when you look at the thousands upon thousands of laws that are in this country, you can pretty much pin anything on anybody, given enough time and given access. I mean, certainly we all know that Adam has no respect for the illegal, unconstitutional war on drugs, but it's not beyond comprehension that they could have planted these mushrooms there. He may have had them there, he may not have had, but in 5 hours they can pretty much plant anything they want to there. Now, charging documents, this is also reported from the Washington Post, charging documents filed in the court Wednesday morning said that Kokesh was charged with possession of hallucinogenic mushrooms, a Schedule I narcotic, while possessing a firearm. Possession of a Schedule I or II drug is a felony in Virginia, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and a maximum of $2,500 fine. If convicted of possession of the drugs while also in possession of a firearm, he would face an additional minimum of 2 years in prison. Well, basically, Adam has put it here on the line, and we really appreciate his act of civil disobedience. It's very important that when the government is acting in a criminal manner, essentially the same thing that happened with Ed Snowden. Here's a person who is being vilified as a criminal, being hunted down by the U.S. government, and yet what he did was expose criminal actions by the U.S. government. He didn't send trade secrets to another country for profit or personal gain. What he was doing was exposing criminal actions by our own government. And when the people who do the right thing, like Snowden, when people who do the right thing, like Kokesh, it's Kokesh who is obeying the law. It's Kokesh who is illustrating that the Constitution says one thing, the Supreme Court says the same thing, and the District of Columbia says something else. But I want you to think about how this is treated differently. Look at the case of the football player for the New England Patriots, Hernandez, who was arrested. Now, they didn't kick his door down. They didn't stay there and bully people in his household for 5 hours. Instead, they just came in and arrested him. Also, look at the difference in the way they treated NBC's David Gregory. If you remember, as part of a newscast, he held up a firearm that was prohibited under D.C.'s gun laws. And for holding that up, he could have faced, for having possession of it, he could have faced a $1,000 fine and a year in jail. And certainly other people, as part of the news crew, could have been exposed to that. And yet, the Attorney General in District of Columbia said he wasn't going to press charges for them because they're their partners in the mainstream media. So it brings up the whole question of equal protection under the law and how the elites, the government, and the media are treated by a different standard than the rest of us. And as a final example, take a look at this story from InfoWars just today, that a Democratic aide brings a gun into a courthouse and receives nothing but a ticket. Security officers at a federal building in downtown Detroit found a gun in the purse of Betty Petrenz, Conyers' office manager. Bringing weapons into a government building is strictly prohibited, but she received no sentence or formal punishment, only a ticket that will be stricken from her record if she demonstrates good behavior. So I guess the good behavior would just be being an aide for Congressman Conyers. So there's one set of rules for the elite, one set of rules for the politicians and the political class and their cohorts in the media that they alert whenever there's going to be any raids so they can get a good photo op out of it. And then there's a different standard for the rest of us. It's kind of like the ruling class versus the sheeple. And you can see that very clearly if you look at another example. Let's say John Corzine. Now, Corzine is not going to be facing criminal charges over MF Global. And this is from an article in InfoWars today. He said, if you are a billionaire, former Goldman Sachs CEO, ex-governor, and one of Obama's biggest donors, and you steal $1.2 billion directly from the accounts of your customers, and you cover up that theft, you are not a criminal. But if you reveal the unconstitutional spying on all American citizens by the government, you are a traitor and face life imprisonment. Or, in the case of Adam Kokesh, you point out that the District of Columbia is violating the Constitution and a Supreme Court decision. I'm going to keep repeating that. Then you are a criminal, not the District of Columbia, not Police Chief Kathy Lanier. The article goes on to say the criminal probe into whether there's wrongdoing on the part of Corzine by the Department of Justice will now be dropped due to lack of evidence, said a report in the New York Post citing a person with knowledge of the matter. Now, how is this different from Bernie Madoff? Bernie Madoff, if you remember, built customers out of $10 billion approximately. Well, $18 billion. Corzine has, according to one count, over 27,000 commodity customers claims totaling over $10 billion, with more than 1,000 securities customer claims totaling $1.4 billion. So that's still being determined. But in one case, you have someone who doesn't have political connections like Corzine, a former governor and senator, and you've got somebody who is well connected politically. One person goes to jail for stealing $18 billion. The other person speculates and loses $10 billion and absconds with billions of dollars, and nothing happens to him. That's the difference between the ruling class and the sheeple. And of course, we have another example of this in Iowa. This story from the Daily Journal in Iowa says some cities with traffic cameras are giving a pass to the Iowa governor's SUV, whose plates aren't on file. If Governor Terry Branstad's state vehicle speeds through Iowa's two largest cities, the driver could enjoy a perk that tens of thousands of other motorists would envy, a break from the aggressive photo enforcement of speeding and red light violations. The SUV's status, in which its license plates are not included in police databases, came to light last week in records related to a high-speed pursuit in April, where state police officers had no idea whom they were following at up to 90 miles per hour. After that incident, a state agent complained to superiors that the governor's vehicle routinely speeds, putting public safety at risk, and should not be treated differently than ordinary citizens. Well, of course, this is something that has been going on for quite some time. This is just the new technological version of this, where the database is already pre-set up to just ignore it so that nothing ever happens, instead of just throwing out the tickets or telling the police officers not to give tickets to the governor. So he's free to drive 90 miles an hour through the lights, whatever he wants to do, and it's just a non-event because he's part of the ruling elite. Now, in another example, look at how much differently they treat you and I. Look at the contempt that they have for the common citizens. In New York City today, the feds are exposing subway riders to a chemical gas, and they admit ignorance to health effects. The New York City Metropolitan Transit Authority supposedly released a notice to subway passengers, not only thanking them for being gassed lab rats, but also admitting that they weren't fully aware of what the gas exposure health effects would be. Now, this is from a flyer that was reported to be from the MTA. We find out later that it really wasn't, but listen to this. It's actually more frank and more honest than what the MTA and the New York Police Department put out, and we're going to talk about how these two basically compare to each other. This one is very truthful, and we'll contrast that with what the New York Police Department and the Metropolitan Transit Authority put out. Now, in the false flyer, what it said was, "Thank you for writing the MTA." They don't thank anybody in their press release. "At this time, we would like to thank you for participating in a joint study conducted by the New York Police Department and Brookhaven National Laboratory, sponsored by the Department of Defense. We still do not fully understand the health effects of perfluorocarbon gas exposure, though exposure to perfluorocarbons are linked to the early onset of menopause. Studies in animals have found these gases significantly alter liver and thyroid function, increase the risk for tumors, and cause failure in reproductive organs. These gases are being dispersed as a test for your protection against unwarranted chemical attacks." Now, that's true. Every bit of that is true. And it is also, you can find that on the internet. You can see that the effects of perfluorocarbons are exactly that. They cause fertility problems, they cause the early onset of menopause, and they cause an increase of tumors and cancer. But you won't find that information in the official release from the government. Instead, what they have is a study. It's called the S-SAFE study, or I guess it's kind of a SAFE study. It's kind of a stuttering there because they know that it's not true. And they're talking about in their press release, they're proud of the fact that they got $3.4 million from the Department of Homeland Defense. And they tell you that these are harmless tracer gases that they're detecting being sprayed out. Now, put this in perspective. We're told that we need to go to war against Syria because the Syrian government released gases on its citizens. And Russia today has put forth some evidence that says that those gases that were released were actually released by the rebels that the U.S. government is supporting. But the U.S. government itself can release gases that cause early onset of menopause, cause infertility, and cause tumors, and yet there's no problem with that. That's the double standard that we're looking at. And it's very similar to what we saw happen last fall with the EPA. The EPA conducted illegal human experimentation, and that's what this is. This is illegal human experimentation. They're exposing to people to gases that they know are harmful, and yet doing it anyway. The only difference is that at least when the EPA was doing it, they were monitoring the people to see what happened. They're just exposing in New York millions of people during the day. They could very easily, if they wanted to test the gases, they could use something that is not harmful. They could also do it at a time when there's not a lot of people there, but they choose to do it at rush hour so they can expose the most number of people. Criminal actions. Same thing we saw from the EPA. And when the EPA did this, they were exposing people, if you remember, to particulate matter that they had said that the administrator of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, had said was fatal. She emphasized that it wasn't a level that was going to make people sick. It was a level that would kill them. Now, fortunately, she was lying about that, but they were looking for people with respiratory and cardiac problems, so these people would have an event and they could justify regulations that were more strict than the ones that they had. The problem was that they were exposing people to 70 times, in some cases, the level that the EPA had said was unsafe, just trying to get more strict regulations. Now, why is the Department of Defense and the New York Police Department doing this in New York City? We don't know. Supposedly, it's for your safety. Everything that they do to us, supposedly, is for our safety. Now, the April flyer that was put out mentioned that these were perfluorocarbons. This is from the April flyer. It said that they will support Brookhaven. They were talking about how in 3 months, in July, they were going to do this. They will support Brookhaven scientists tracking the movement of harmless tracer gases. But then they identify these quote-unquote harmless gases as perfluorocarbon tracer gases. They said they present no health or environmental hazard. They are non-toxic, inert, odorless, invisible, and have been used in airflow studies since the 1980s. Except that if you look at other government sites, you will see that they have the effects that we were talking about infertility and that sort of thing. Now, for more information about what our government is doing in terms of eugenics and sterilization, here's a report from Gigi Arnetta.
The U.S. government has been busy denying their big brother behavior in our daily lives, but they can't deny their involvement in eugenics. Here's the latest. A new and investigative report shows that nearly 150 females were sterilized between 2006 and 2010 by doctors under contract with the California Department of Corrections. One prisoner who worked in the infirmary overheard medical staff encouraging multiple offenders to be sterilized. Although federal and state laws ban prisoner sterilizations with federal monies, California used state funds. The San Francisco Gate shows a map of California's role similar to the Nazis' goal of purification and the state's contribution to eugenics. California was the second state to pass eugenics laws in 1909, 2 years after Indiana made it legal to sterilize the feeble-minded. According to the University of Virginia bioethicist Paul Lombardo, Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in 1916, and in 1934 she was quoted saying, "America needs a code for babies. The purpose of the American Baby Code should be to provide for a better distribution of babies, to assist couples who wish to prevent overproduction of offspring, and thus to reduce the burden of charity and taxation for the public relief, and to protect society against the propagation and increase of the unfit." More quotes from Margaret Sanger. "The most merciful thing that a family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." Here's another one from Margaret Sanger. "Birth control must lead ultimately to a cleaner race." Moving forward, presidential frontrunner for 2016 Hillary Clinton was awarded the Margaret Sanger Award in March of 2009 and claimed to be in awe of her.
I admire Margaret Sanger enormously. Her courage, her tenacity, her vision. I am really in awe of her.
All this is just more evidence that our government likes to play God. Not only are they sterilizing human beings, but now they've moved on to our pets. The U.S. government is scheduled to start testing a new vaccine to sterilize dogs.
The government vaccine, Gona Khan, is scheduled to be tested in September on 2 Indian reservations. In the Gona Khan tests, dogs will be caught, microchipped, tattooed, collared, injected, and released, says spay and neuter expert Ruth Steinberger.
Their idea is to control the dog population. Population control? What happened to our government just governing? Secure your copy of the new DVD, State of Mind, today at InfoWarsShop.com. You can get it on Blu-ray or DVD at InfoWarsShop.com. I'm Gigi Arnetta with your InfoWars Nightly News Alert.
Well, it wasn't just the banksters at the top of the banking system that profited from massive fraud with TARP and other bailouts. We find out that the corruption was actually systemic. Although it was being directed by those at the top, we find out that even employees at lower levels were profiting from fraudulent behavior. InfoWars reports today bonuses were given to Bank of America employees for home foreclosures. Bank of America employees in the mortgage servicing unit systematically lied to homeowners, fraudulently denied loan modifications, and paid staff bonuses for foreclosing on people's homes. Now, this is part of the Home Affordable Modification Program, HAMF, which was supposed to lower homeowners' monthly payments so they could afford their payments and sustain their home for the long term. Borrowers were supposed to make 3 trial payments before loan modification became permanent. Instead, the borrowers were left making trial payments for up to 1 year and then were rejected for permanent modification. Homeowners were left owing the difference between the trial modification and the original payment. Bank of America employees were told to lie to customers, telling them their files were incomplete or missing when they weren't. The delay and rejection programs were methodically carried out under the overall direction of Patrick Carey, a vice president of Bank of America, who oversaw the entire Eastern region's loan modification process. This is very similar to what we reported on just a week or two ago about the Irish banksters doing a rope-a-dope on the Irish government and taxpayers, telling them that it was a small amount of money that they needed for a bailout. I think they just, as he said, he pulled a figure out of his arse, is the way he put it, of $7 billion. He just made that figure up. And they were caught talking to each other on the phone with some recordings, laughing about how they just made this figure up, knowing that it was much higher. It turned out it was more along the lines of 30 billion pounds, not 7 billion pounds. And it nearly bankrupted the Irish government, certainly put a tremendous burden on the taxpayers. Well, this is essentially the same thing done to individual homeowners. If you remember, the original TARP program was set up to help people with their mortgage payments. Congressmen were told and senators were told by the Treasury Department and by other bankers that they were going to have martial law if they didn't have a TARP program. But rather than relieve anybody of the mortgage that they could have paid off 75% of all the mortgages, instead, the bankers kept all the mortgages, paid themselves large bonuses, and are using things like the HAMP program to trick people. Rather than relieve people of their mortgage obligations or rather than helping them, the bankers were actually tricking them into getting farther in debt, getting behind in their payments so they could then take the homes in foreclosure. Now, we have a video here from Germany that is actually it was descriptive of what had been going on in the United States, but it was actually also prophetic about some news that came out today. Take a look at this. This is an individual who sets up a bunch of equipment in his van, and he's actually calls himself a light artist, and he projects this image here of Kim.com, and above him it says United Stasi of America. And it's pointing out that the United States government is acting exactly like the Stasi. Now, he projected this on the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. They know exactly what the Stasi is about in Berlin. The difference is that between the Stasi and what we've got today is, of course, at the time, the Stasi reportedly had over half of the population reporting on each other. And, of course, that's what it looks like we're going to have here as Obama is ordering government workers to spy on one another. An InfoWars story says this is where the bureaucratic snake starts to eat itself. Basically, it works like this. Watch your coworkers, and if they're acting the slightest bit strange, one had better report them or face disciplinary or even legal action. Now, here's the actual memo from De Fuhrer, Obama and his minions here. They said, this went out to federal employees. Federal employees and contractors are asked to pay particular attention to the lifestyles, attitudes, and behaviors, like financial troubles, odd working hours, or unexplained travel, of their coworkers as a way to predict whether they might do harm to the United States. Managers of special insider threat offices will have regular, timely, and if possible, electronic access to employees' personnel, payroll, disciplinary, and personal contact files, as well as records of their use of classified and unclassified computer networks, polygraph results, travel reports, and financial disclosure forms. Isn't that amazing? Truly is an Orwellian state. Unlike the Stasi, though. The Stasi, as I said, reportedly had more than half of the people as informants, but they didn't have a way to mine the data. They collected all this information, but it really wasn't that useful to them because they couldn't process it. That's not what we have today in our modern technocracy. They have the ability to process and store everything, and they have the ability to data mine and correlate that information, which makes our Fedcoats, our Stasi, our United Stasi of America, far more dangerous than any tyranny that has ever been in the history of the world. The entire framework has been set. They have created for themselves a supposedly legal framework that has been set up by secret courts where we have no arguments on the other side. We can't see what those decisions are, but in their imagination, they believe that they have modified the Constitution and our fundamental rights and liberties, which themselves transcend the Constitution. They're not granted by the Constitution, they are recognized by the Constitution. But our government believes that they have fundamentally transformed the legal framework. They have the technological framework in position, and what we're looking at is a high-tech dictatorship potential that is unlike anything the world has ever seen in history. Now, look at how they divide and conquer people with manufactured dissent. This article from Pajama Media says newly released documents detail the Department of Justice's role in organizing Trayvon Martin protests. This was Judicial Watch filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Department of Justice back in April. And what they learned was a very little-known Department of Justice unit called the Community Relations Service. Sounds a lot like community organizers, doesn't it? Or community agitators. And what they found is that this Community Relations Service was being funded and actually deployed was the term that they used. In March 25th, they have a timeline here from these FOIA request documents. They were actually deployed to Sanford, Florida, back in March, and they were being funded from various amounts, from $500 or $600 to about $1,200 each event. They were being deployed to basically foment conflict between different people, different groups. What we have here is, as they've said, never let a crisis go to waste. This is something that was just too good for our government to pass up, because here they have an opportunity to pit one racial group against another, to put it in those terms, which is really what it's taken on, as well as attacking the Second Amendment all at once. So our federal government couldn't pass up that opportunity, so they create an organization, a little unit, to go down and to do things like providing support for protest deployment. They provide technical assistance to the city of Sanford, event organizers, and law enforcement agencies for the march and for a rally on March 31st. They provide technical assistance and conciliation, on-site mediation during demonstrations. This is absolutely amazing. They provide technical assistance for preparation of possible marches and rallies related to fatal shooting of a 17-year-old African-American male. And they mentioned that several times in here, that it's about an African-American male, because that's a big part of it, doing a race war, trying to set up conflict, divide and conquer, separating people into competing groups, left and right, black and white. But what's the biggest lie? The biggest lie that our federal government tells us? Well, they want us to believe that there's a trade-off between liberty and security, that there's some zero-sum game. And certainly we can trade our liberty thinking that we're going to get security, but we don't. And as we see that trade-off increasingly being put out there by the federal government, we start to believe that they're opposites of each other, that you can't be secure if you don't have liberty, and that if you're going to be secure, you have to give it up. But the real opposite of liberty is not security. The real opposite of liberty is slavery, because when you give up all of your liberties, you're going to be a slave, and slaves never have any security. Some people are starting to understand this. In an InfoWars article, poll shows massive swing in public view of terror and liberty trade-off. It says a new scientific poll out this week finds that former NSA leaker Ed Snowden is viewed by the majority of Americans in a positive light as a whistleblower and not as a traitor, as the mainstream media and government officials would like to have it. When given two options, 55% of poll respondents said they believed him to be a whistleblower, while only 34% saw him as a traitor. But here's the more interesting aspect, I believe, in this article. Perhaps a more telling revelation from the poll is the fact that by a 45 to 40% margin, voters now believe that the government goes too far in restricting civil liberties in the name of anti-terrorism efforts. And if you saw that graph that we were showing, that's a dramatic turnaround. The blue is people who believe that liberty is more important. And you can see they were vastly outnumbered by the people in red earlier on who believe that security should predominate in that kind of a trade-off. Again, it's a false trade-off. It's a false deal. You will never get security from liberty. And fortunately now in this latest poll, we see that over half of the people realize that they're not getting any more security for the freedoms that they've lost. Hopefully we're going to see a change in that. Well, that's it for our tonight's news. We'd like to tell you about a new book that we're just starting to carry. It's called Breakthrough, and it's about the guerrilla war that is being conducted by James O'Keefe and his organization, and it's how they're. It's a great book here. We just started carrying it at InfoWarsStore.com. It's their guerrilla war to expose fraud and to save the democracy is a subtitle on it. And if you want to help expose fraud and save our democracy, you can support us here at InfoWars at prisonplanet.tv. Get a subscription for yourself and 10 other people to use simultaneously. That helps to support the operation, and it helps to spread the news. Well, that's it for tonight's news. Stick around after the break. We have Paul Watson interviewing Silky Carlo, so stay tuned for that. Now.